"We were beaten, sir. Mama said you might help," unaware the lonely cowboy would never leave them. The wind howled through the small town, carrying dust and the smell of sagebrush with it. It was a place where people kept to themselves, and the days seemed to stretch on forever. At the edge of town, where the houses were few and far between, lived a man known only as the cowboy. He wasn't like the others. He kept to himself, rarely seen unless he was riding through the town on his horse or working on his ranch. People said he was a loner, a man of few words, someone who preferred the silence of the open fields to the chatter of townsfolk. But there was more to him than just being a quiet man. Behind his rough exterior and the weary look in his eyes, there was a heart that had been broken, a heart that had learned to shut itself off from the world. He had his reasons, reasons that no one in town fully understood, but that didn't matter to him. He had his ranch, his horses, and the freedom of the open land. That was all he needed. One late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to set, and the sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the cowboy was tending to his horses when he heard a faint voice. At first he thought it was the wind playing tricks on him, but then he heard it again, louder this time. "Help, please!" He turned toward the sound, his heart skipping a beat. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw two children, their clothes torn and faces bruised, standing at the edge of his property. The boy, maybe 8 or 9, looked up at him with wide, fearful eyes. The girl, a bit younger, clutched her brother's hand, her small frame trembling. The cowboy's first instinct was to turn away. He had no business with children, especially ones that looked like they'd been through hell. But there was something in their eyes, something that stopped him from walking back to his barn and ignoring them like he did with everyone else. The children took a few tentative steps toward him, the boy's voice shaky as he spoke again. "We were beaten, sir. Mama said you might help." The words hung in the air, and for a moment time seemed to stop. The cowboy's heart tightened in his chest. He had heard stories, rumors whispered in the town about a woman and her children, how they lived in fear of an abusive man who had gone off somewhere, leaving them to fend for themselves. But he didn't know it was this bad, didn't know that the children were so badly hurt. Without thinking, he walked toward them. The girl flinched at his approach, but the boy held his ground, still holding onto his sister's hand. The cowboy knelt down, trying to make himself less threatening. "Who hurt you?" he asked, his voice low and steady. The boy hesitated, but then spoke in a whisper. "Papa, he hit us. Mama tries to stop him, but he always does it again." The cowboy's jaw clenched. He had no patience for men who laid hands on children. He could see the marks on their faces, the dark bruises on their skin, and the way they moved, like animals trained to avoid a blow. His mind raced as he thought of the woman, the mother who must be out there somewhere waiting for help. "Where's your mama?" he asked, standing up. The boy nodded toward a small, run-down shack a few hundred yards away. The cowboy didn't hesitate. He walked toward the house, with the children following closely behind him. When they reached the door, the boy knocked softly, and it creaked open to reveal a woman standing in the dim light. She was young but worn. Her clothes were tattered, her face pale and tired, and her eyes red from crying. She had clearly been through more than any person should. She looked up at the cowboy, and for a brief moment they locked eyes. She said nothing, but there was a silent understanding between them. She knew that he was the one her children had turned to, the one they believed would help them. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I don't know what to do anymore." The cowboy stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. He wasn't a man known for offering help, let alone taking in strangers. But something about this woman, her brokenness, pulled at him. It was like he saw a part of himself in her, a part of his past that he had buried long ago, a past filled with pain and loss. He knew what it was like to feel helpless, to feel as if the world was crushing you and there was no one to turn to. After a long pause, the cowboy finally spoke. "I'll help. You and your kids can stay with me. I have a place on the ranch. It's not much, but it's safe." The woman's eyes widened in disbelief. She took a step back, then another, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You'll take us in, even after what we've been through?" He nodded. "You're safe now. No one's gonna hurt you here." It wasn't much, but it was the best he could offer. The woman hesitated, then slowly nodded. Thank you so much." The cowboy turned and started walking back toward the ranch, the children trailing behind him. The woman stayed a moment longer, looking back at the life she had known, then followed them. As they walked, the cowboy felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. It was a sense of purpose, of responsibility. He didn't know it yet, but this moment, this decision would change his life forever. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for so long would soon be replaced by the presence of this family, and with it, a bond that would be stronger than anything he had ever known. The cowboy led the small family across the open fields toward his ranch, the sound of their footsteps mingling with the whisper of the wind. The children, still hesitant but relieved, walked closely behind him, glancing up at the vastness of the land around them. To them, the ranch was like something from a dream, so different from the cramped, cold house they had left behind. The ranch was open and alive, with green fields stretching as far as the eye could see. They had never seen so much space before, and for the first time in a long while, they felt the weight on their shoulders lift just a little. The mother followed, her footsteps slower but determined. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She didn't know what to expect, but the kindness of the cowboy had been enough to give her a small sense of relief. She wasn't used to being helped, not by anyone, and certainly not by a man she didn't know. But something in his voice, something in the way he had spoken to her children, made her believe that maybe, just maybe, this stranger could help them find the safety they so desperately needed. When they arrived at the ranch, the cowboy stopped at the entrance to the barn and turned to face them. "This is where we'll be," he said, his voice steady but not unkind. "It's not fancy, but it's a roof over your heads." The children peered inside the barn, their eyes wide with curiosity. The interior was simple but tidy. There was a small stove in one corner, a few chairs scattered about, and several beds lined up along the wall. It wasn't much, but it was warm and clean, and it felt like a place where they could finally rest. The mother stepped inside slowly, her hands trembling. She took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the air fill her lungs. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was walking on eggshells. There was no shouting, no fear of what might come next. For the first time, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. As the evening wore on, the cowboy moved quietly around the barn, lighting the stove and making sure there was enough wood to last through the night. He didn't speak much, but his actions were kind and deliberate. He wasn't used to having company, especially not after so many years of living alone. But something about this family felt right, like they belonged here, in this place that had always been so empty. The children, meanwhile, began to explore their new surroundings. The boy, who had always been so quiet, now seemed to have a bit more energy. He walked around the barn, running his fingers along the rough wooden beams and staring at the horses in the stalls. His sister followed, picking up a few stray pieces of straw from the ground and giggling as they scattered in the air. They were still scared, still unsure of what the future held, but the warmth of the barn and the promise of safety had brought a little light into their hearts. The mother, too, began to relax. She sat down on one of the beds, her hands folded in her lap. She watched the cowboy work, unsure of how to thank him for everything he had done for them. She had been on her own for so long, used to doing everything herself, that the idea of someone else stepping in to help was hard to accept. But she couldn't deny the kindness he had shown, the quiet strength that seemed to come from him. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The cowboy didn't look up from his task, but he nodded, acknowledging her gratitude. "You're welcome," he said simply. There was no need for further words. His actions had spoken louder than anything he could say. Later that night, after the fire had been built and the evening had settled into a peaceful silence, the cowboy sat at a small table by the stove. He stared into the flames, lost in thought. His life had always been solitary, just him and his ranch, and sometimes the horses. He had grown used to being alone, to keeping people at arm's length. But there was something about this family, something about the way they had arrived at his doorstep, that made him feel like he had been waiting for them all along. He didn't know what had driven him to help them. He didn't know what had made him decide to take them in, offer them shelter. Maybe it was the way the children had looked at him with their wide eyes, trusting him even when they didn't know him. Or maybe it was the desperation in their mother's voice, the way she had begged for help as if she had nowhere else to turn. Either way, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to turn them away. He had already made his decision, and there was no going back now. As the night wore on, the mother, now feeling more at ease, joined him by the stove. She sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot tea. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They both simply sat in the quiet, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. It was a strange kind of peace, one that neither of them had experienced in a long time. Finally, the mother broke the silence. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "You don't have to keep us here. We can leave if it's too much. We don't want to be a burden." The cowboy glanced up at her, his eyes soft but firm. "You're not a burden," he said quietly. "No one deserves to live like that. No one deserves to be afraid of their own home. You're safe here for as long as you need." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment the cowboy allowed himself to believe them. He had never been the type to make promises, but somehow this felt different. This felt like something worth protecting. The mother nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. It was the first time in a long while that she had felt something other than fear or worry. Maybe, just maybe, this cowboy could give them the peace they so desperately needed. As the fire burned low and the night grew darker, the family settled into the warmth of the barn. They didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, they felt like they were exactly where they needed to be. The cowboy, too, knew that this moment, this decision, was just the beginning. He had taken them in, and in doing so, he had unknowingly invited something more into his life, something he hadn't realized he had been missing for so long. Days passed, and the cowboy kept his promise. The family began to settle into their new life at the ranch. The children played outside, running through the fields and climbing the trees that dotted the property. For the first time in what felt like forever, they were able to just be kids. They weren't hiding, they weren't scared of every noise, and they didn't have to worry about what the next day would bring. They had food on the table, clean clothes, and a place to call home. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. The cowboy, for his part, kept his distance, but always made sure they were well taken care of. He didn't know how to talk to people much, especially not after so many years of being alone. He was a man of few words, more comfortable with the company of his horses than with people. But he still checked in on the family every day, making sure they had what they needed and that they were safe. The mother, who had once felt the crushing weight of fear and helplessness, slowly began to trust again. At first, she had hesitated to accept the cowboy's help. It was hard for her to rely on someone else, to open up and let someone in after so much pain. But as the days went by, she saw the sincerity in his actions. He didn't ask for anything in return. He just helped because he could, and that made all the difference. One afternoon, as the sun began to set and painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, the mother sat by the barn, watching her children as they fed the horses. She felt a strange peace wash over her. It was a peace she hadn't felt in years, not since before the violence had begun. She was grateful, but there was a part of her that still struggled with the thought of depending on someone else. She had always been strong, or at least she had tried to be. But now, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the ranch and the steady presence of the cowboy, she started to believe that maybe it was okay to let go of the fear, to let someone else take on some of the weight for a while. The boy with his mop of unruly hair approached her with a wide grin on his face. "Mama, look, I can ride a horse now," he called, his voice filled with excitement. She smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," she said, watching as he proudly climbed onto the horse and started to trot around the barn. The girl, not to be outdone, ran over with her own grin. "I want a ride too," she shouted, her laughter ringing through the air like music. The mother watched them with a sense of awe. It was hard to believe how much had changed in such a short time. Her children were no longer just surviving, they were thriving. They were learning, growing, and finding joy again. And in that moment, she realized how much they had been robbed of before. They had lived in fear for so long that she had almost forgotten what it was like to see them so carefree. The cowboy, who had been watching from the door of the barn, stepped forward. "You're both doing great," he said, his voice steady but warm. He wasn't much for praise, but he couldn't help but admire the children's progress. They had come a long way since that first day when they had shown up at his door, bruised and afraid. The mother glanced up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, the words feeling too small for the thanks she felt in her heart. The cowboy nodded, acknowledging her words but not needing to say more. He turned to leave, but the mother stopped him. "Would you like some supper?" she asked. "You've been so kind to us. The least I can do is make you a meal." The cowboy hesitated, his usual instinct telling him to decline. He wasn't used to people offering him anything, least of all a meal. But something in the mother's voice made him pause. It wasn't just an offer, it was an invitation, a way for her to show her appreciation. And for the first time in a long while, he found himself wanting to accept. "Sure," he said, his voice quiet. Later that evening, as they all sat around the small wooden table in the barn, eating the simple meal the mother had prepared, the cowboy realized how much he had missed this. The sound of laughter, the warmth of shared company, the sense that, for once, he wasn't alone. The mother and her children were still adjusting to their new life, still carrying the weight of their past, but they were slowly becoming a part of his world. And in return, they were letting him become a part of theirs. As the meal came to an end, the boy looked up at the cowboy with wide, serious eyes. "Will you stay with us?" he asked, his voice filled with hope. "Will you be our papa?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment the cowboy didn't know how to answer. He had spent so many years pushing people away, keeping them at arm's length. He had never wanted to be anyone's father, especially not after all that had happened to him. But looking at the boy, at the girl, and at the mother who had started to trust him, he felt something inside him stir. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. "I don't know about being your papa," he said finally, his voice soft, "but I'll always be here for you." The boy smiled, his eyes lighting up with joy. "That's all we need," he said simply. The mother, her eyes filled with emotion, reached across the table and touched the cowboy's hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. "We're not used to people being kind to us. I don't know how to repay you for everything." The cowboy shook his head. "You don't have to repay me," he said. "Just take care of each other. That's enough." As the night grew darker and the stars began to twinkle overhead, the family sat together, the warmth of the meal and the quiet comfort of each other's company filling the barn. The cowboy, who had spent so many years alone, finally felt something he had almost forgotten: belonging. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time he wasn't afraid of it. With this family, with the children who had come into his life and the mother who had shown him a new way to care, he felt like he had found a home. The days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, the family grew closer. The children learned more about life on the ranch, and the cowboy, who had once kept to himself, began to notice the change in his own life. It wasn't just about helping them anymore. He found himself invested in a way he never expected. He was teaching the boy how to saddle a horse, and he was showing the girl how to care for the garden. Little by little, the cowboy was becoming a part of their world, and they were becoming a part of his. The mother, who had once been so unsure and fragile, was starting to find her own strength again. Every day, she worked beside the cowboy on the ranch, helping him with the animals and learning new skills. It wasn't easy for her. She still had memories of the past, the fear, the pain, but now she had something to hold on to. She had hope. The cowboy's quiet, steady presence gave her the courage to move forward, to build a new life for her children, away from the fear that had once consumed them. But just as everything seemed to be falling into place, a shadow from the past returned. One afternoon, as the cowboy worked in the barn, he saw a dust cloud rising in the distance. It was a sign that someone was coming. The familiar figure of a man on horseback appeared over the horizon. It was him, the children's father. The cowboy's heart sank. He had hoped that the man had gone for good, that he would never have to face him, but now it seemed that hope was fading. The man rode up to the ranch, his horse's hooves kicking up dirt with each step. The cowboy could see the anger in the man's eyes from a distance, the same kind of anger that had likely led to the abuse in the first place. As the man dismounted, the air grew tense. The children's mother, who had been standing in the yard, froze when she saw him. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, it was as if all the fear from the past came rushing back. The cowboy could see her hands trembling, her body stiff with anxiety. The man walked toward the barn, his steps slow but deliberate. He was a tall man with a rough face and a body hardened by years of hard work. But there was something about him that made the cowboy's blood run cold. He had no doubt that the man was trouble. "Where are they?" the man growled, his voice thick with menace. The cowboy stood tall, blocking his path. "You're not welcome here," he said firmly, his voice low but strong. He wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he wasn't about to let this man hurt the family he had taken in. The man's eyes narrowed. "You're the one who's been playing hero, huh?" he sneered. "You think you can just take my family? They belong to me." The cowboy didn't flinch. He had seen this kind of thing before, people who thought they had a right to control others, to take what didn't belong to them. but the family wasn't his to give away. They had come to him for help, and he wasn't about to let this man drag them back into the nightmare they had escaped. "You're not taking them anywhere," the cowboy said, his voice unwavering. The man stepped forward, but the cowboy didn't move. He was ready for whatever came next. The mother, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped outside. Her face was pale, but there was a fire in her eyes that the cowboy had never seen before. "You don't have a say in this anymore," she said, her voice steady. "My children are safe here. You don't get to control us anymore." The man's face twisted with rage, but he seemed to hesitate. For a moment it looked like he might lunge at her, but then he seemed to think better of it. He turned and glanced back at the cowboy. "This isn't over," he muttered, before mounting his horse and riding off. The cowboy stood there for a moment, watching him go. He didn't trust that the man was really gone, but for now the family was safe. He turned to the mother, who was standing quietly, her eyes still wide from the confrontation. "You're all right," he said gently, walking toward her. She nodded, but the fear in her eyes hadn't completely gone away. She had seen the man's anger, and it had brought back all the memories she had tried to bury. But now she was stronger. She had the cowboy by her side, and she had her children to protect. She wasn't going to let the past destroy her again. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice full of gratitude. The cowboy gave her a reassuring nod. "He won't come back, not as long as I'm here." As the days passed, the memory of the encounter with the father lingered in the air. The children didn't know exactly what had happened, but they could sense the tension. They stayed close to the cowboy, who continued to teach them about the ranch and the animals. The mother, too, found comfort in the routine of daily life. She worked alongside the cowboy, helping him with the chores and starting to build a new sense of independence. But even with the man gone, there was still a feeling of uncertainty that hung over them. The cowboy could see it in the way the mother watched the horizon, always alert, always waiting for something to happen. He knew that the past couldn't be erased, no matter how much they wanted it to be. The scars were still there, hidden beneath the surface. One evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned a deep shade of purple, the cowboy sat with the mother outside the barn. The children were inside, playing and laughing, oblivious to the weight of the world. The air was cool and the stars were beginning to twinkle overhead. The cowboy turned to the mother. "You've come a long way," he said quietly. She smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "I don't feel like I have," she said softly. "There's still so much to be done." "So much I have to heal from." The cowboy nodded, understanding more than she knew. "Healing takes time," he said. "But you're not alone anymore. You've got your children and you've got this place. You've got me too if you need help." She looked at him, her eyes filled with emotion. "Thank you," she said again, her voice barely a whisper. For the first time in a long while, the cowboy felt something stir within him. It was a feeling he didn't know how to describe, a feeling that told him that this family, this small, broken family, had become something more to him. They weren't just people he had helped. They had become a part of his life, a part of his heart. And he knew deep down that he would never let anything or anyone hurt them again. The days became weeks, and the weeks slowly turned into months. Life at the ranch had a rhythm now, one that felt peaceful, steady, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, safe. The mother had found her place in this new life. She worked side by side with the cowboy, learning more about the ranch every day. She grew stronger, not just physically, but emotionally. The walls she had built up around her heart, brick by brick over the years of fear and pain, slowly began to crack. She had been terrified to trust again, but she was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was room in her life for love, for happiness, and for a future where she didn't have to constantly look over her shoulder. Her children, too, were thriving. They had gone from being quiet, frightened little ones to energetic, curious kids who loved exploring the wide-open land. They would run through the fields, laughing and playing, their voices carrying on the wind. They had become attached to the cowboy, who had given them so much more than just shelter and safety. He had given them something invaluable, a sense of normalcy. They learned to ride horses, to take care of the animals, and to respect the land that had become their home. The boy, once quiet and unsure, was now full of energy and confidence, always excited to learn something new. The girl had become the cowboy's shadow, always asking questions and eager to help with anything she could. It was clear that they had started to heal. The cowboy, too, had changed in ways he hadn't expected. He had always been a solitary man, keeping people at a distance. never allowing anyone to get close enough to see the cracks in his own heart. But the presence of this family had broken through his walls. He found himself looking forward to their laughter, to the sound of the children's voices echoing in the yard, to the quiet moments he shared with the mother when the sun set and the sky turned shades of purple and gold. He didn't know when it happened, but somewhere along the way, he had become attached to them. They had become his family, and he had become theirs. One warm afternoon, as the sun beat down on the land and the smell of hay filled the air, the mother sat on the porch, watching her children as they fed the horses. The cowboy stood nearby, fixing the fence, his sleeves rolled up, sweat glistening on his brow. The air was thick with the scent of fresh-cut grass and the distant hum of bees. It was a simple, peaceful day, but for the mother, it was a moment of reflection. She had come so far from the woman she had been when she first arrived at the ranch, broken, scared, and unsure of what to do next. Now she felt different. She felt strong. The cowboy had shown her that strength didn't always come from being alone, from doing everything yourself. Sometimes strength came from trusting others, from letting down your guard and accepting help when you needed it. It was a lesson she had never expected to learn, but one that had changed her life forever. She looked up at the cowboy who was focused on his work, and a small smile tugged at her lips. There was a quiet comfort in the way he moved, the way he worked, the way he cared for the land and the animals. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. She had seen it in the way he took care of her children, in the way he had stepped up to protect them when the father had come back, in the way he had never once asked for anything in return for his kindness. He was a man who had carried his own burdens for so long, and yet he had chosen to help them carry theirs. The mother stood up and walked over to where he was working. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say, but then she spoke from her heart. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly. "You've done more for us than anyone ever has." The cowboy paused, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. He didn't speak right away, but his eyes softened as he looked at her. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice steady but kind. "I'm just doing what anyone would do." She shook her head. "No, it's more than that. You've given us something I never thought we'd have again. You've given us peace. You've given us a future." The cowboy looked away for a moment, his eyes distant. He wasn't good with words, not when it came to feelings. But the warmth in her voice, the sincerity, made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was a feeling that made his chest tighten, something he wasn't sure he knew how to handle. "I didn't do anything special," he said, his voice low. The mother reached out and touched his arm gently, her hand warm against his skin. "You did everything special," she said softly. "You gave us a chance, and I'll never forget that." The cowboy's heart raced, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he stood there, feeling the weight of her words. It was a strange thing to be thanked for something so simple. But for him, it was a reminder of how much they had changed his life. He had never wanted to be a father, never wanted to take on the responsibility of others. But in the quiet moments, in the way the children had looked at him with trust, in the way the mother had opened up to him, he realized that he had found something he hadn't even known he was missing. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the family became a true family. They celebrated the little victories, learning how to ride horses, building the barn, planting the garden. The mother's strength continued to grow, and the cowboy found himself enjoying the life he had once thought was not for him. The children, full of energy and laughter, became the heartbeat of the ranch. The cowboy couldn't remember what it had been like before they arrived, before their presence had filled the empty spaces in his home and his heart. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden light over the land, the cowboy sat with the mother on the porch, watching the children play in the yard. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them was comfortable, filled with a quiet understanding. The mother turned to him, her voice soft. "Do you ever think about the future?" she asked. The cowboy looked out over the fields, his eyes thoughtful. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "but mostly I'm just focused on today, on this." She smiled, a small but genuine smile. "I think I understand that now. I never thought I'd get to have a tomorrow, but now—" Her voice trailed off, and she looked out at the children. "Now I have hope again?" The cowboy nodded. He didn't need to say anything more. The future wasn't something to fear anymore. Together they had built something real, something lasting. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. It was all they needed. As the evening turned to night and the stars began to fill the sky, the cowboy knew one thing for certain. This family, this life, was something worth protecting. No matter what the future held, they would face it together. The seasons changed, and with each passing day, the family continued to grow stronger. The once quiet ranch had transformed into a lively place, full of laughter and activity. The mother, no longer weighed down by fear, had taken on the role of not only caretaker but also teacher. She worked hard alongside the cowboy, learning the ropes of ranch life and passing on those lessons to her children. She had always been resourceful, but now she felt like she was finally living up to her potential. There was something beautiful in the rhythm of their daily lives, the simple tasks, the shared meals, the moments of peace that filled the ranch. The children had blossomed, each day bringing new adventures and new lessons. The boy, who had once been so shy and withdrawn, had grown into a confident young man. He was eager to help with the animals, and he spent hours learning how to repair fences and take care of the horses. His love for the ranch grew each day, as did his admiration for the cowboy. He would often sit beside him while he worked, asking questions and listening intently. The cowboy didn't always have answers, but it didn't matter. The boy was content just being in his presence, learning from him in silence. The girl, too, had found her place. She had a natural gift for caring for the animals, and it was clear that the horses were especially fond of her. She would spend hours brushing them, talking to them, and leading them around the ranch. Her bond with the cowboy was equally strong. She followed him around, wanting to be involved in everything he did. And though he was usually reserved, he couldn't help but smile at the way she looked up to him. It was a reminder of how far they had come, how much their presence had changed his life. The cowboy, for his part, had begun to let go of the walls he had built around himself. He still kept his quiet, solitary nature, but the family had become an essential part of his life. He found himself looking forward to the evenings when they all sat together, enjoying each other's company. They were a family now, and the cowboy didn't feel the need to hide from that truth. He had once believed that he wasn't meant to have a family, that he was meant to be alone. But now he realized how wrong he had been. They had brought meaning back into his life, and he was grateful for every moment they spent together. One evening, after a long day of work, the cowboy and the mother sat on the porch, watching the children as they played in the yard. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the land, and the air was filled with the gentle sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. It was a peaceful moment, one that the cowboy had come to cherish. He could hear the laughter of the children, the way their voices carried across the open fields, and he couldn't help but smile. This was what life was meant to be, simple, quiet, and full of love. The mother turned to him, her eyes soft in the fading light. "Do you ever think about how much has changed?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. The cowboy looked out over the ranch, his eyes following the children as they ran. "All the time," he replied quietly. "I never thought I'd end up like this. I didn't think I wanted anything more than what I had, but now I can't imagine life without you all." Her heart swelled at his words, and she reached out, resting her hand gently on his. "I feel the same," she said softly. "When we first came here, I didn't know what to expect, but now I can't imagine going back to the way things were." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. The cowboy had never been one to talk much about the past, but there were moments like this one, when he found himself reflecting on how far they had all come. When he had first opened his door to the children, he hadn't expected any of this. He had thought it would be a simple act of kindness, a brief chapter in his life. But it had turned into something much more, something real, something lasting. The mother squeezed his hand. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. I don't know what we would have done without you." The cowboy glanced over at her, his eyes soft but steady. "You don't have to thank me. You've done as much for me as I've done for you. This, us, it's not one-sided. It's all of us together." The words hung in the air, and for a moment everything felt right. The cowboy had never been one to make promises, but here, with the mother beside him and the children playing in the yard, he realized that he had made one, a promise to always protect them, to always be there for them, no matter what. That night, as the family sat together for dinner, the cowboy looked around the table, taking in the sight of his family. The children were laughing, their faces bright and full of life. The mother was smiling, a warmth in her eyes that he had never seen before. It was a sight that he had never thought he would experience. He had been a loner for so long, afraid of getting too close to anyone, afraid of losing them. But now he understood. Family wasn't about being perfect. It was about being there for each other, through the hard times and the good. As the meal came to an end, the cowboy stood up and walked over to the window, looking out over the land. The stars were starting to appear in the sky, and the night was quiet, peaceful. It was hard to believe how much had changed, how much had been rebuilt in such a short time. He had never imagined that he would find himself in this position, surrounded by people who cared for him. It was a life he had never expected, but it was one he had come to cherish. He turned to face the mother, who was now standing beside him. She smiled, her hand resting on his arm. "We've come a long way," she said softly. He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "We have." For the first time, the cowboy wasn't afraid of the future. He didn't know what it would bring, but he knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't face it alone. The family he had helped to build was his now, and together they would face whatever came their way. As the night settled in, the sound of the children's laughter echoed through the house. It was the sound of a home, a family, a life built on love and trust. And in that moment, the cowboy knew that he had found something he had been searching for all along: a place to belong.